and action.
When I was a kid, Christmas Eve was my favorite night of the year. My grandmother's aunts, uncles, and cousins would all get together, and there was something about celebrating Christmas that night that made it feel different from any other night of the year. Most kids had to wait until Christmas morning to open their presents, but I got to open presents on both Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. So for me, Christmas Eve was basically the best of both worlds. But before the presents, there was another tradition that made the night special. My family would gather around the table for our Italian-American Christmas Eve dinner, known as the Feast of the Seven Fishes. I grew up celebrating this tradition with my grandmother and extended family, and now that I am an adult, I have continued the tradition myself. I try to cook as many of the seven fishes as I can on Christmas Eve, and I invite anyone who does not have a particular place to go. Because this tradition has been part of my life for so long, I wanted to learn more about where it came from and why it has remained so important to Italian-American families. The Feast of the Seven Fishes is a tradition influenced by Catholic customs and Southern Italian food traditions that developed into an important part of Italian-American culture. Today, I want to explain where the tradition came from, what foods and customs are associated with it, and why it continues to bring families and communities together. First, the Feast of the Seven Fishes has roots in Southern Italian and Catholic traditions. Christmas Eve, which is known in Italy as La Vigilia, has traditionally been associated with eating seafood instead of meat. This was connected to the Catholic practice of abstaining from meat on certain religious days. For Catholics, Christmas Eve was a day of preparation for Christmas, and avoiding eating meat became a part of that preparation. According to anthropologist Michael Di Giovanni, seafood was especially important in southern Italy, where many communities were located along the coast and had long-standing fishing traditions. So eating fish on Christmas Eve was both religious and practical. People were following the traditions of their faith while also eating food that was readily available in their communities. When large numbers of Italians immigrated to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they brought their food, religious customs, and holiday traditions with them. As these immigrants established families and communities in America, their traditions began to change and adapt. This is actually an important distinction when talking about the Feast of the Seven Fishes. The tradition, as we know it today, is primarily Italian-American. National Geographic explains that seafood on Christmas Eve is common in parts of Italy, but the specific idea of a large Feast of the Seven Fishes is much more strongly associated with Italian-Americans. Even the number 7 has an uncertain history. There are different theories connecting 7 to Catholic and biblical symbolism, such as the 7 sacraments, but there is no universally accepted explanation for why 7 became the traditional number. Some families serve exactly 7 types of seafood, while others serve more or fewer. So there isn't one official way to celebrate the Feast of the Seven Fishes. And that brings me to the part everyone probably thinks of first, the food. The Feast of the Seven Fishes does not have one specific menu. Different Italian-American families have developed their own recipes and traditions based on where their families came from, what seafood was available, and what their families enjoyed eating. Some traditional dishes included salted cod, fried calamari, stuffed clams, shrimp, mussels, oysters, octopus, eel, seafood salad, and different types of seafood pasta. For some families, the meal can involve several separate courses. For others, multiple types of seafood are combined into one dish. The Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage gives an example of an Italian-American family that combined shrimps, clams, mussels, scallops, and squid into linguine with a spicy fra diavolo sauce. Consumer Reports also explains that younger generations have continued adapting this tradition, changing recipes and preparation methods while still maintaining the basic idea of a seafood-centered Christmas Eve meal. I think that flexibility is one of the reasons the tradition has survived. It doesn't have to look exactly the same for every family. It can change, and that is something I can relate to personally. Now that I'm an adult, I try to cook as many of the 7 fishes as I can on Christmas Eve. When I was younger, I didn't really think about all the work that went into preparing the meal. I just knew that there was going to be a lot of food, my family was going to be there, and Christmas was finally here. Now I see the preparation differently. Cooking the food myself has become part of the tradition. I understand that the recipes, the preparation, and even the time spent in the kitchen are part of what connects one generation to the next. And that leads to the third and probably most important part of the Feast of the Seven Fishes, its role in preserving Italian American culture and bringing people together. The feast has become a way for Italian Americans to maintain a connection to their heritage. DiGiovine's research describes the Feast of the Seven Fishes as a tradition that strengthens Italian American family relationships and cultural connections. Food is one of the most powerful ways that culture survives. Think about a family recipe. A recipe can be written down and passed from a grandmother to a mother, from a mother to a daughter or son, and then to another generation. Even if the people making the recipe have never lived in the same country as their ancestors, their food can still create a connection to that history. The USC Digital Folklore Archives has documented Italian American families using the Feast of the Seven Fishes as a way to connect with their Italian heritage and previous generations of their families. The Smithsonian has also documented families where grandparents originally prepared the Christmas Eve meal and later generations eventually took over the cooking. That is exactly what happens with many cultural traditions. They don't necessarily stay the same. Instead, each generation changes them a little while keeping the parts that matter most. This is what happened in my own family. When I was younger, the tradition belonged to my grandmother, aunts, and uncles. I was one of the kids sitting at the table, enjoying the food, listening to everyone talk, and waiting for the presents. Now I have become one of the people responsible for keeping the tradition going, and I've also added something of my own to it. I invite people who don't have a particular place to go on Christmas Eve. For me, that is one of the most meaningful parts of the tradition. The feast isn't just about having 7 different kinds of fish sitting on a table. It is about having people around the table. It is about making sure people have somewhere to go, something good to eat, and people to celebrate with. In that way, my family's tradition has grown beyond just being a holiday meal. It has become a way of sharing something that was important to me as a child with people who may not have had that same experience. When I think about Christmas Eve now, I realize that what made it so special was when I was a kid was never really just the food or even the presents. It was the tradition. Today we explored Southern Italian and Catholic influences behind the Feast of the Seven Fishes, looked at the variety of seafood and family traditions that make up the Christmas Eve meal, and discussed how the feast continues to preserve Italian American culture and bring people together. The Feast of the Seven Fishes is more than an elaborate Christmas Eve dinner. It is a living tradition that connects generations through food, family, culture, and community. When I was a kid, Christmas Eve was my favorite night because I got to spend it with my grandmother and eat an incredible meal, and best of all, open presents twice. But now that I am an adult, I realize that the best part of Christmas Eve was never really the presents, it was the tradition. Today I try to keep that tradition alive by cooking as many of the 7 fishes as I can and opening my table to anyone who does not have a particular place to go. I went from being the kid waiting for a seat at the Christmas Eve table to becoming the person who makes sure there is always one available. Thank you.